morning, everyone. So glad to have you all here. It's at this time, by the way, that children ages 3 through 5th grade are released for children's church. So you're welcome to go in the back with Leonie. She'll take you back to children's church. As we begin our new series is all on the book of Matthew, which is kind of exciting for us. We're shifting gears a little bit from Hebrews to Matthew, and that's what we'll see here this morning as we're looking at protecting the throne of heaven. That's what things start out as with this new sermon series. So you can see the title there. It's Falling Before Our King, looking at the good news of Matthew. Now, one thing that we're doing here as we move into this is that we're kind of highlighting some things from a biographical sketch. In other words, it means it's the story of Jesus that we're looking at. It's the gospel of Jesus, the good news of Jesus. When we first moved to the Middle East in 1998, everything was exciting and new, and we were learning a new culture and a new language. And one of the aspects of learning a new culture was learning how to live in an absolute monarchy. Bahrain, where we landed there, was a kingdom, and the king was named Sheikh Isa bin Salman Al Khalifa. There was a distinct park that we went to, that we loved to go to, that we enjoyed as Westerners, but not everybody in the country could go to this. In fact, Arabs weren't allowed to go to it. It was just reserved for Westerners because it was called Sheikh's Beach. It was his own personal beach. In fact, the sand was imported from Italy. You'd think that the Arabian Gulf would have enough sand of its own, but they wanted a nice, pristine white sand. And so the sand of this beach was imported from Italy. And he would allow, that was one of the places where women could wear bathing suits. Now, in the rest of the country, if any women go swimming, they go swimming in the full garment, head to toe. That's the full black garment. That's what they go swimming in. But not at Sheikh's Beach. Sheikh's Beach, since it was open to Westerners, women could wear their normal swimwear and that sort of thing. Well, we'd heard that occasionally the king would come out of his palace and visit with people. And in fact, one time, this I thought was so ironic, one of our friends who happened to be the director of Youth for Christ for the nation, she was invited to come and have tea with the king of the country. And so she, went up and had tea, and she thought it was just a little bit ironic that, she was, leading Youth for Christ in the country, quietly, under the cover, so to speak, not openly, but nonetheless, she was invited over. Well, we enjoyed some sun, we enjoyed some snorkeling, and one day the king was greeting people as I walked by, and it was interesting, being arm's length from the king of a country. Certainly something that I've never experienced in Wisconsin or Minnesota, but it gave me a taste of the absolute power that royalty has in such a place. So today we are looking at the introduction to the book, the introduction to the introduction, in fact. That's what I'm starting with. Matthew didn't have to teach the idea of an absolute monarchy. The Jewish people knew all about that. In fact, they were anticipating the absolute monarchy. They were anticipating the Messiah to come and establish his rule across the boundaries of the land and the people of Israel. That's what they were hoping for. I mean, through the time of the intertestamental period, since the Old Testament, they were looking at these prophecies thinking, God, we can't wait for this to happen. We're excited for it to come. This is good news for us. And by the way, that's the name, or that's the word that we're focusing on. When we talk about the gospel of Matthew, that's the word right there. It just simply means good news. good spell is where it comes from in Old English. And in Old English, good spell meant a good tale, a good story. And so this was definitely a good story, that Jesus has come into the world, that the Messiah is here, that he, in fact, took on himself the sin of the world and paid the price for that sin. And that he rose victorious so that we ourselves, by believing in him, can rise victorious as well. That's the good news, the gospel in a nutshell. Well, that brings us to the question, as any good investigative reporter would have. They'd have these questions: who, what, where, when, why, and how, right? And so we're going to answer those questions today as we even look at what this is all about. Now, some of you, I know, are going to be a little bit overwhelmed with a lot of the historical information today. Some of you are going to glaze over and perhaps, shall I say, even catch up on a little bit of rest. At which point the person next to you has all authority to jab you in the side, in the elbow, in order to wake you up and stir you from your rest. Otherwise, others of you will simply drink up this historical information and the logical reasoning that we'll go through, and as we answer these basic questions. If it's not your cup of tea, just hold on, maybe catch a few of those Z's, but at your own risk, and then rejoin us here in a few minutes. Who wrote this book, and whom was it written to? Matthew is universally regarded as the author of this book, except for higher criticism theologians who have an affinity for questioning every author of Scripture. Matthew, who was also known as Levi, was called as a disciple in Matthew chapter 9, verse 9. He was a tax collector, which tells us a few things about him, which makes sense why he, for example, would have such a meticulous record of Jesus' life and how he would make that record. In Matthew 22:19, we read this: "Show me the coin used for the tax." And they brought him a denarius. So this is Jesus that's talking. It doesn't say, "Show me a denarius." That would be the generic term for a day's wage. Show me a day's wage. That was what a coin was. But Matthew, being a tax collector, being highly connected to money and knowing the difference, he uses this specific word for coin, not just the generic word for denarius. That indicates somebody who knows their way around money like a tax collector would. Well, next that brings us up to what? Oh, by the way, I do want to point out that this was written to Jewish believers. We could look at all of the citations of the Old Testament, all of the emphasis on the Messiah and the kingly reign and establishing his rule among the people of Israel, and we can understand that this is written to Jewish believers. And then you have a gospel like Luke that brings in Gentiles as well and incorporates more Gentiles into the story. But this is particularly for Jewish believers. So what is it? This is the gospel of the kingdom. Of all the different gospels, they each have their own affinity. Like I said, Luke is kind of the gospel for the downtrodden, for the Gentiles, for women, for example, for the paralyzed, those people that are looked down on in society. Mark was the beginning gospel. It's actually likely Peter's account of the gospel. John is more of a theological gospel. It is well established in the theological meaning of what Jesus did, and it was written well after, probably in the 90s. Not the 1990s, remember, just the 90s. As simple as that is. Well, Matthew is the gospel of the kingdom. It is the good news of the kingdom rule of Jesus. There's a man named Papias who wrote in the 2nd century. He was an early church father, and he wrote this. He said, Matthew compiled the oracles in the Hebrew dialect, and everyone translated them as he was able. So, was Matthew's gospel written in Hebrew, like Papias says, or was it written in Greek, which we only have Greek editions? We do not have a Hebrew or Aramaic copy of the Gospel of Matthew. Well, I actually think it was written in both. I would postulate that Matthew, since he was a tax collector, had access to writing materials, something like notebooks, so that he could write notes along the way. He probably wrote those in his first language, which would have been Hebrew. And so he had those notes in Hebrew. And then later, he wanted to compile a complete story of Jesus, and so that's when he used those notes in order to put together the Gospel of Matthew as we see it today. And that would have been received across the whole Greek world. So was it written in Hebrew or in Greek? Yes, it was written in both Hebrew and Greek. It makes sense to me that those notes were not necessarily preserved because the full gospel was there. Why would you need the scraps of paper that were falling apart along the way? Why would you need those that had been transported with him as he's traveling with Jesus when he had the full account? So, the next question we have is where? Where? Well, Matthew himself was from Galilee, and he ministered with Jesus in Galilee and Jerusalem. But Matthew has this sense of it being for this message being for the whole earth, for everyone, everywhere, at all times. That's what we get from the sense of Matthew here, that he wanted to communicate that the gospel of Jesus was not limited to a specific locale or people. His aim was not to show that Jesus was to show that Jesus was the promised descendant of Abraham, who would be a blessing to all nations. In fact, that's what we see in Genesis chapter 12, as you can look back here. It says, I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. How beautiful for Abraham to hear those words. But this now stretches out beyond just Abraham's family and to the rest of the earth. I will bless those who bless you. I will curse anyone who treats you with contempt. And all the peoples on earth will be blessed through you. That's pretty cool. That's pretty cool that through one man, the blessing came for all people. And that's what we celebrate in Jesus, being this message of good news that is not limited to just one locale or one time period. We read so powerfully in Matthew 28, where Matthew takes this and he applies it to the disciples, but then he says, hey, don't just stop there. Here's what it says. Go, therefore, and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe everything I have commanded you. Remember, I am with you always to the end of the age. So there it is. That's a key, an integral part of Matthew's gospel. His good news message is that it is not just for the Hebrews, not just for the people that he's writing to, but far beyond that for all people in all places at all times. So, when was this written? Well, AD 65 to 67. I'll just give you the answers. You can just fill in the blanks right there on your test and your homework that you have. There are some historical witnesses that indicate that Matthew was written first. So that's why Matthew comes first in the Bible. However, it is very likely that actually Mark was written first in the mid to late 50s. So that's 5, 6, 7 years before this. Luke was probably written in 61 or 62 when the book of Acts ends. Matthew would have been the third gospel actually written pen to paper. And John concludes the 4 around 95 AD. Why was Matthew thought to be first? Again, I'll point back to that same testimony of that man called Papias, where he wrote about the book being written in Hebrew. I think Matthew's Hebrew notes were the first written during and in fact during the life of Jesus. I think Matthew was going along because he had the materials, because he had the knowledge of writing. Not everybody was able to read and write at that time, but Matthew, being a tax collector, he obviously would have been. And so I think he's going along as a disciple with Jesus, writing these things down because he's got the writing materials and he has the knowledge. He's writing those in Hebrew, and so that gives the idea that his account comes first. But in fact, I would tend to think that Luke and Mark had access to Matthew's gospel when Mark was the first one to put together the whole story. And then Luke came along and said, okay, yeah, I got what you're saying there, Mark, but given Matthew's notes and the other things that I researched from Mary, obviously she's the only one that could give the account of Jesus' birth. So he gets all this information from Mary and the other people that he interviewed, and he wrote his story. And then Matthew says, yes, that's right, and here's the whole account that I remember, given my notes and all of those different things. So that's kind of how I see these Gospels being laid out. Now, supporting this idea is the record of Irenaeus. Irenaeus was the bishop of Lyon, France, and in the second half of the 2nd century. He said directly that Matthew wrote his account while Peter and Paul preached in Rome. Okay, that's an important bit of information. That would have put Matthew's account clearly in the mid-60s, right where we have it here. So that's, I would say, the best basis of, the date that Matthew was written. It was about 65 or to 67, AD 65 to 67. Okay, why? Here is the central purpose of the whole book. So I encourage you to write this down or snap a picture of it, whatever you want to do. This is the central theme of all that we're going to preach on over the next year. Okay? This is the core thing that you boil it down to. Why did Matthew write this book? It was for this reason: to offer irrefutable proof that the long-awaited Messiah had come to inaugurate God's kingdom on earth. So he's saying this goes all the way back. We've been waiting for this for ages. Hundreds and hundreds of years. We've been waiting for this moment. And Jesus is here as the Messiah to start God's kingdom reign on earth. That's the purpose. Okay, how did he do this? Well, through meticulous notes. I've been reading recently a book called The Notebook, a history of thinking on paper. It's a fascinating history of the way the simple notebook has influenced society. We take it for granted, for example, that we can go down to Walmart or Target or Staples or wherever and buy little field notes. Well, these didn't always exist. In fact, even at the time that Jesus and Matthew were around, they didn't have paper. It was papyrus and leather skins that would be used, and different things, even clay, ostraca, or what they're called. They're pieces of clay that people would write notes on in order to keep for later. We didn't have the beautiful moleskin. Isn't this nice? Now, I like these sort of notebooks and things like this. And you'll find a number of these filled in my office because I've used these for years and years. But those didn't always exist. It wasn't just on the 8th day of creation that God made moleskin. They came much later than that. We have easy access to a wide selection of paper and pens and markers and binders and so on. But it wasn't always this way. Through the centuries, tools for writing have been very expensive. So only the privileged few would have access even to the materials for writing. And then to have knowledge of how to use them, to be literate, that's something that a tax collector would have. That's something that a government official would have. That is not something that common people had for the most case. But he had the personality type, Matthew had the personality type to keep these sort of records and the financial means to pay for these expensive materials. Jesus called the perfect people to accomplish all that he intended to do for the Jewish people and beyond. Even through freedom, God controls all. Well, that's not the end of the history lesson this morning. We're going to dig into some different things, but that's the end of the who, what, where, when, why, and the how. Okay? Now we're looking at links of a chain. This chain, we'll see, lasts through a number of different generations. Those will be represented as people here, but it's over a couple of thousand years. That's what we're talking about. And as you can see there, from Abraham, he lived about 2000 BC, up to David, he lived about 1000 BC. That's a long stretch of time. Well, let's take a look at some of the people that are involved in this genealogy that we see here. The book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac, and Isaac the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers. And Judah was the father of Perez and Zerah by Tamar. They were twins, by the way. By Tamar, and Perez the father of Hezron, and Hezron the father of Ram, and Ram the father of Amminadab, and Amminadab the father of Nahshon, and Nahshon the father of Salmon, and Salmon the father of Boaz by Rahab, and Boaz the father of Obed by Ruth, and Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of David, the king. David was the father of Solomon by the wife of Uriah. Okay, we're going to stop there. We're going to look at these in different sections. And like I mentioned, this first section is Abraham to David. Now, one of the most notable points about the period between Abraham and David that we just read about here is the notorious women. And I say notorious. Notorious means that, yes, they're well known, but typically because of not so good reasons. And that was the case with the four women that are mentioned here. Abraham and David, you have here a list of notorious women. In the entire list of Jesus' ancestors here, 4 women make an appearance, and all of them are clearly less than perfect. Tamar was a Canaanite. Rahab was from Jericho. Ruth was from Moab. And Uriah's wife, Bathsheba, was probably a Hittite, along with her husband. While preaching through Hebrews, we saw in the case of Esau that marrying foreign women was considered sexual immorality. Just in and of itself, that alone. So each of these 4 women would have been a threat to the genealogy of the Messiah. Keep that in mind. One of the reasons that foreigners were a threat is that God did not want Israelite children being raised with teachers that would bring sin into their minds or into the family, even if those teachers were their mothers. That's why God didn't want intermarriage with these heathen neighbors that were all around Israel. Tamar, for example, trapped her father-in-law in an incestual relationship while pretending to be a prostitute. Rahab actually was a prostitute. Ruth was honorable, but still a foreigner. Bathsheba was complicit in adultery with the king. These are not high watermarks for the ancestors of the Messiah. Why would God work through such sin? Because they were not high watermarks by anyone else's standards. for God working through these sinful women, and yes, there were many sinful men in this list as well, but working through these women in Jesus' ancestry showed that he can make something beautiful out of even the most sordid people. When we say that God predestines the future, that he knows the future and that he controls the future, it is not to say that we are on some deterministic path where all the molecules of the universe bounce into one another in some predetermined way so that God's will works out in the end. We would have a real struggle, if that were the case, keeping God from being culpable or responsible for sin. Think about that for a minute. If he deterministically caused all the molecules of the universe to bounce together such that in 2025, I am walking through Walmart in the snack aisle and I happen to see a box of Nutty Bars and I buy it and eat the whole thing in a fit of gluttony. Am I absolved of guilt? Is God responsible for it? Actually, he started all the molecules rolling, right? He got them knocking into each other, and so that my mind is just a mix of molecules, and that decision that I made, well, God's ultimately responsible, not me. See how that's a little bit of a trick that we get ourselves into. Same can be said for these sinful women. Were part of Jesus' heritage. God didn't cause their sin, rather worked out the perfect result of the heritage of the Messiah, Jesus, in spite of their sin, because he knew what would happen all along. He knew what they were going to do and how they were going to sin. Different things that were falling into their lives. I say all of this because this is supposed to be encouragement to you, that when you get to that point that you say to yourself, I did it again, I fell into sin again, why does this keep happening to me? I'm trying, I'm fighting against sin, but then I find myself in this mess, crying on the floor. God can work. He did it in his Son. He did it in the history of his own Son. There are three types of knowledge that God has. The first is his knowledge, his natural knowledge. God knows the interactions of all molecules everywhere. Okay, so he does, in fact, know what's going to happen and which molecules are going to bump into which and what's going to cause the molecules to be in my mind to trigger a fit of anger or something like this, or eat those Nutty Bars and not be able to restrain myself. God knows those things are what are going to happen. That's his natural knowledge. The second type of knowledge that God has is free knowledge. That is, he knows the end result. He knows what's going to happen long before it ever does. The third type of knowledge that God has is what is called middle knowledge. And what that means is that God knows all the conditions that are going to cause me to eat and feast on those Nutty Bars. Okay? So he knows when I'm going to sin and when I'm not going to sin because he knows all of those conditions that are going to bring that about. That temptation that comes to me, he knows when it's going to be too much. And he knows when I have an ability to resist against it. That makes him not responsible for the sin, but he certainly knows it. And in fact, he can use that knowledge and he can work it for his good. And for the good of us who love him. So, when I'm walking through Walmart and I have an extra $2.97 at my disposal, and I'm depressed or angry or sad or celebrating or just about any emotion, I'm walking out with those Nutty Bars, right? He knows the conditions in which I will freely choose to go into gluttony on Nutty Bars. The awesome reality of middle knowledge and the genealogy of Jesus, God can use broken people. That's something for us to rejoice in. Might mess up, fall into grievous sin like adultery or conspiracy or lying or murder like Bathsheba. Yet God knows what we will do through those conditions so that he can use those broken people and steer them back to a right path. In this way, he knows all things, but he himself is not responsible for our God. Awesome. A related point worth noting is that these women were all foreigners. This means that the heritage of Jesus indicates God's plan to include other nations. It is not just for the people of Israel. God picks 4 other nations to specifically cite in this genealogy. Just as Israel and other nations would receive the blessing of the Messiah King, Israel and other nations had a part in bringing about Messiah. Even through freedom, God controls all. Let's continue reading here, and we'll start again with verse 6. And David was the father of Solomon by the wife of Uriah, and Solomon the father of Rehoboam, and Rehoboam the father of Abijah, and Abijah the father of Asaph. By the way, there's going to be a test on pronunciation on all of these afterwards. You can pick up one of the sheets. And Asaph the father of Jehoshaphat, and Jehoshaphat the father of Joram, and Joram the father of Uzziah, and Uzziah the father of Jotham, and Jotham the father of Ahaz, and Ahaz the father of Hezekiah, and Hezekiah the father of Manasseh, and Manasseh the father of Amos, and Amos the father of Josiah, and Josiah the father of Jeconiah, and his brothers, at the time of the deportation to Babylon. Now, to us, those might just seem like a long string of names. And I mentioned this to one of my friends who lived in the Middle East when we were there in the Middle East. Sema was his name. And I asked, I said, Sema, can you believe all of these names and things like this in the Bible? I mean, that people actually knew their names? And he instantly recited all 12 of his, the first 12 of his grandfathers, ancestors. Wow, that's amazing. I can't do that. In fact, I'm stuck 2 generations back. I mean, I know my dad and my grandpa. That's it, at least on my dad's side. So I don't have this series of all of these different generations, and yet Matthew searched them, knew them. This is the line of the Messiah. Of course he would know these. In 2 Kings chapter 23, we read this about Josiah. Josiah is the person I'm going to hone in on during this period, this link. And Josiah removed all the shrines also of the high places that were in the cities of Samaria. Sounds like a good thing to do, doesn't it? Wait a minute. Josiah was actually a descendant of all of these sinful relations. But this is a sign of hope, which kings of Israel had made, provoking the Lord to anger. He did to them according to all that he had done at Bethel. And he sacrificed all the priests of the high places who were there on the altars and burned human bones on them. Then he returned to Jerusalem. And the king commanded all the people, keep the Passover to the Lord your God, as it is written in this book of the covenant. For no such Passover had been kept since the days of the judges who judged Israel, or during all the days of the kings of Israel, or the kings of Judah. But in the 18th year of King Josiah, this Passover was kept to the Lord in Jerusalem. What an awesome celebration. I'll read a little bit more here. Moreover, Josiah put away the mediums and the necromancers and the household gods and the idols and all the abominations that were seen in the land of Judah and in Jerusalem, and that he might establish the words of the law that were written in the book of Hilkiah the priest, found in the house of the Lord. Josiah was a righteous king. Josiah was what Israel would hope for. He cleansed all the filth that was in that God knew was going to be there. God knew all of what the people of Israel would do, that they would sacrifice to these idols and that they would have these other priests and things. Josiah put them to death and burned their bones on their own altars. He was a righteous king. God worked things together for good, those who love him. Even through freedom, God controls all. Our last point here today is another link, which is the exile to the Messiah. About 586 BC, actually exactly 586 BC to 4 BC when Jesus. And we read this. And after the deportation to Babylon, Jeconiah was the father of Shealtiel, and Shealtiel the father of Zerubbabel, and Zerubbabel the father of Abiud, and Abiud the father of Eliakim, and Eliakim the father of Azor, and Azor the father of Zadok, and Zadok the father of Achim, Achim the father of Eliud, and Eliud the father of Eleazar, and Eleazar the father of Mathan, and Mathan the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom Jesus was born, who is called Christ. All the generations, from Abraham to David, were 14 generations, and from David to the deportation to Babylon, 14 generations, and from the deportation to Babylon to the Christ, 14 generations. I want to quickly back up to verse 16. I'll put that on the screen there. Verse 16, which says that Jacob was the father of Joseph, who is the husband of Mary. But I want to look at that in particular because we see something different in Luke chapter 3, and this helps us to put the whole thing into context. Luke chapter 3, verse 23 says this, Jesus, when he began his ministry, was about 30 years of age, being the son, as was supposed, of Joseph, the son of Heli. Son of Heli. It's a little bit puzzling, isn't it? Matthew says that Joseph was the son of Jacob, and Luke says that Joseph was the son of Heli. Atheists love this because it looks like a contradiction. In college, I was taught that Matthew records the genealogy of Joseph, whereas Luke records the genealogy of Mary. But I don't know that quite does it. Why is it then that Matthew stresses those 4 women, but Luke does not, even though he wrote a gospel specifically for women and Gentiles, the downtrodden? We could also ask, why does Luke begin with Joseph if it's actually Mary's genealogy? I've taken my professors at their word for 30 years, but that leaves these questions unanswered. Instead, we can see that the Jewish idea of an ancestor is that he fathered the entire line. Yes, he fathered the immediate descendant and the immediate descendant after that, but he also fathered 20 generations down. And that's what we see here, where there's a purpose that Matthew has in talking about 14, in highlighting 14, and then 14, and then 14. It's not a direct record of all of those people. In fact, that's more of what we get in Luke, where those are the common people. Those are the everyday people that he records them all the way through. But Matthew, he records the kingly line. He highlights these key people along the way. The genealogy of Matthew includes key lighthouses along the path of ancestry of the Messiah, particularly those that show that Jesus was the rightful heir of the title Messiah, King. When you track these generations, sometimes there are gaps such as even 200 years between Boaz and Rahab in verse 5, which says, and Salmon, the father of Boaz, by Rahab. Rahab was 200 years before Boaz ever lived. So, was the Bible wrong? Does this strike at the heart of inerrancy? Did Matthew, who was so careful in keeping track of details, simply make a mistake? No, and no. You're only going to think that this is wrong if you try to make the Bible say something more literal than it actually is trying to say. But Matthew has a theological purpose for this 14, 14, 14. I want to show that to you here. Again, consider what Matthew's purpose is for the whole book, to offer irrefutable, that's easy for me to say, proof that the long-awaited Messiah had come to inaugurate God's kingdom on earth. So that's his aim. That's what he wants to offer people. This genealogy offers irrefutable proof that Jesus was the prophesied descendant of Abraham through David. This genealogy traced the royal line to show that Jesus could rightfully accede the throne. Luke's genealogy showed the common descendants, the direct descendants, but Matthew showed that Jesus was the rightful heir, the title Messiah. This is kind of the Cliff's Notes. Luke's was War and Peace. It's got all the details. He didn't even include all of the descendants, so we shouldn't try to force that either. So if there weren't merely 14 generations from Abraham to David, and then David to the exile, and then the exile to Jesus, why did Matthew make such a point of saying 14, 14, 14? Here's the best reason I've seen to explain this. Now, Hebrew and Greek both used gematria, which is using their letters for numbers. And that's how they had their numbering system. So if you wanted to say, for example, the number of the beast is man's number, which is 603 score and six, what Revelation 13:18 says, that's 666. That comes from gematria. In this case, what do we have? Since we're talking about Hebrew, let's look at the number 14. 4 plus 6 plus 4. What is the number, the letter for 4? Well, it's D. What's the letter for 6? That's V. What's the letter for 4 again? Well, that's D. David. You see what he's doing here? There were no vowels in Hebrew when they were written. Those vowel points were added much later. Just including these words, this DVD is not just an ancestor of the VHS. We're talking about David here. David. So he says, in other words, David, David, David. In the life of Jesus, everything you see about him, he is the king. He is the rightful Messiah. That's the awesome meaning of 14, 14, 14 that Matthew recorded for us. So how will you respond to Jesus as king? Will the king of the universe be allowed to tell you what to do or what not to do? If the king of the universe says, "Go therefore and make disciples of all nations," you do it. If the king of the universe says, "Go across the room and apologize for hurting her," so as a point of application here today, I thought of these two things here for you. Make a decision this week. It doesn't have to be by casting lots, but it certainly could be, because what you're doing, you're praying over a decision. You're saying, "God, help me to make this decision." You're letting him control the outcome of that decision. However you do it, whether you make it with lots or what or how, thank God for it. Thank God that he brought you to that decision. Secondly, ask someone if she or he believes that God controls everything. Two applications. Let's pray. Lord Jesus, let us see more and more clearly through this book the message of Jesus, the rightful King. In his name.